and their own writing, and that will also be moderated by the lovely Mina. So with that, I'm going to pop off screen and let the two of you have a wonderful discussion.
Thank you, Pam.
Thank you. Thanks, Pam.
Thank you so much for being here, Erica. I mean, I just, first of all, have to congratulate you for being #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, the USA Today list, Wall Street Journal, Publishers Weekly, Apple Books. That's just incredible.
And their own writing, and that is also moderated.
Yeah, it is incredible, and it
so with that,
me
I'm going to pop off screen and
as to why these books
have
are so
a
popular.
wonderful discussion.
Thank you, Pam.
Thank you. Thanks, Pam.
Thank you so much for being here, Erica. I mean, I just for being #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, the USA.
Finally coming to terms with each other and their relationship, I think. I think in particular it's about our hero, anti-hero, I don't know what people want to call him, Christian Grey, coming to terms with some of his past and you know his the reason why he is the way he is, and it was a sort of deep dive into all of his psyche, and I have to say it was incredibly enjoyable to write.
Well, it was enjoyable to read. I'm curious about, and you probably get this question all the time, is about perspective. Of course, this book and the last 3 books of the series have been in Christian's perspective. The first 3 were in Anna's perspective. And why did you feel like it was important to tell it in that way, where the first 3 books were from Anna and the second 3 from Christian?
Well, as everybody knows, this all started life on the internet as Twilight fan fiction, and in that form. And while I was doing that, and I have to say it was such a blast doing all of that, and that was writing what became Anna's point of view. There were occasional charity things where we wrote elements for charitable giving, and I did a couple of things for what became Christian's point of view, and that ended up, I put them in the back of 50 Shades Freed, and just as a sort of bonus content thing, and people said, "Ooh, can we read this? We want more." And then after the movie, I didn't have a very happy experience making the first movie, and after that I just sat down and wrote the novel to reacquaint myself with the characters, with Christian, and didn't tell anybody. And it was one of this wonderful moment where we announced the book on the 1st of June and published it on the 18th. I wasn't allowed to just drop the ebook, which is what I wanted to do. I wasn't allowed to do that, she said in a sulky voice. So I did that, and people wanted more. So I wrote Darker, and I have several other characters in my head bothering me. And so I wrote Maxim and Alessia's story, because that's been with me longer than 50 Shades had. So I wrote that and managed to get them onto the page and out of my head for a certain amount of time. And then, you know, I was hassled on pitchforks and torches for the last book, and so I decided people would post their pictures of the 3 books and then just the 2, and even I, with my kind of compulsive tendencies, thought, yeah, I can see that that's an issue. So I went away and started writing it, and it was fun because I had to fill in the first 6 weeks that aren't covered with between Darker and 50 Shades Darker and 50 Shades Freed. So I could write new stuff, which was just really enjoyable. And there we go. I wrote the book, and you know, finally got it out. So I'm pleased that that's we're at that point now.
Do you think it was easier to write the second 3 books because you already knew the story?
I wouldn't say, actually, no, I don't think so, because with the with the first three, I'm a complete pantser. I had no idea where it was going to go, and I was so free to just do it. And there's a very liberating element to that. And as it was really written serially, all I had was what went before. I mean, I'd sit and think, "Ooh." And I remember, for example, getting to there's a bit where he's not responding to Anna, and I think, oh, and I'm 3/4 of the way through that chapter. I said, oh, I know, he can be in a helicopter crash. And I just put that in. That was, and it actually tied everything up for various reasons. So I don't know, I don't question it. I don't like to shine too much of a light on why and how that happens. But that was my process. And then beginning this, it's more difficult to write his point of view because I have to match the dialogue and how he's feeling. And sometimes you just think, well, why the hell did you say that? That's the hard thing. And certainly with Freed, there's a certain thriller element to it that we're only vaguely aware of in 50 Shades Freed, because he doesn't tell her anything. But he knows everything. And it was putting all of that information and where that information came in was actually like a huge jigsaw. And it was only once I'd finished it, I said, oh no, that's coming too late let's just move things around a bit. So that was fascinating for me, and trying to make that work. I also really enjoy writing his scenes with Dr. Flynn as well. I hugely enjoy that. And I thought, how can I write a psychologist? I'm not a psychologist, but anyway, I just had a go. So and I was quite pleased with how that turned out too.
Well, as a reader, I think it worked really well because we wondered, and then you brought it all to Freed, which was amazing. I think I thought it would work amazingly because I think that we had those questions in our heads and you answered them.
Good. I hope that I wanted it to be a satisfying read. Thinking, right, okay, this is what he was thinking, and oh, this is behind that, and this is behind that, and that's and at the end of the leaving in a good place, I just thought hopefully this is a good satisfying read. And it's long. My God, is it long?
It is long, but it's so satisfying because it's long. I read somebody on Goodreads said, I wish it was another 500 pages.
I know. Oof.
That probably ended up on your cutting room floor, which someday you might have to share.
Not a lot actually. No, I can honestly say that not a lot ended up on the cutting room floor, which is always pleasing. I'm just very conscious that I wanted to keep them together as much as possible, and that was it. And the only time I really went off piece was when he spends time with his brother. But I enjoyed writing that so much because they're like chalk and cheese, those two. So it's interesting seeing them spark off each other.
Yeah, I mean, if you had been living under a rock for so long, you wouldn't know that the series actually has quite a bit of humor in it.
I think so. Yes, I mean that seems to be the general sort of response I've had. Is I've said I've laughed, I've cried, I've thrown the book on the floor in fury, and you just think, yes, good. That's the kind of thing that you want, some kind of reaction. So, yes.
Which is interesting to me because it gets into what I think about what Christian freedom means, especially sexually, because he used, you thought that he was part of the BDSM lifestyle, but actually he was stuck there. He used it because he was traumatized, which is not the purpose of that. And freedom, maybe I'm talking too much about my own perspective, but what does freedom mean to you from Christian's perspective in terms of his sexual evolution?
I think Christian's sexual evolution is incredibly complex, and I think that his issues aren't to do with sexuality; they're to do with intimacy, and him trying to come to terms with that, and wanting to find that, and not being able to find that because of his issues. I mean, he suffers from a horrible phobia of touch. So I think that's what was interesting for me is actually it was more about intimacy than anything else, and that's what he manages to achieve with the, the long-suffering Anna. But I have to say, reading, writing the book, I just find that she presses all of his buttons all the time. It's like, why did you say that, Anna? Anyway, so it was that was interesting to me as well. And we really, I mean, I always knew that of the two of them, she was far, far stronger. And he was actually incredibly fragile, but that's not at the outward appearance. And I loved seeing her come into her own. And in this book, she really does. She just has enough of his nonsense and lets him know.
And one last question, because I think it's going to come up in every one of your interviews, is that do you think that there'll be a 52.6 Shades of Grey someday? Sort of said you were done, but I don't think your readers are going to leave you alone.
No, they're not. And it's funny. There's something, why didn't we see this? Why didn't we see that? And there is a reason why those aren't there. But I'm going to leave these two alone for a while. I think they're in a good place, and they've had the kitchen sink thrown at them over the last 10 years, even though it's actually only about 6 months within the books. It's really not a lot of time. And just leave them and let them get to know each other and just say never. That's all I can say at the moment. I've got lots of other characters I'd love to explore life with, so I'm hoping I get a chance to do that.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. I learned so much, and it's been such a pleasure to chat with you.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for having me. And enjoy the discussion. I wish I was there.
You can always sneak on. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sure. Oh, that's so funny. I was muted for that whole time. Okay, let's start again. That interview was so much fun. Thank you so much for joining us for the July Love at the Library Book Club, brought to you by Source Books and Baker & Taylor. My name is Mina Jane, and I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts. I'm a lifelong romance reader and believe strongly that you should read what makes you happy. I'm thrilled to be here with Katee Robert, LaQuette, and Adriana Anders. Before we begin our discussion, though, I have a few housekeeping items to make sure that you're aware of. At the end of today's event, we will pick 3 lucky participants to win a romance prize pack to thank you all for registering and attending. Also, we encourage you to submit your questions for the wonderful authors through the Google form link provided in the chat. We're doing questions this way today rather than through Zoom directly as a part of our event security. Thank you for understanding. So that being said, enter your questions and comments into the Google form at the link provided, and we'll make sure to answer them. So let's get started. I'm going to start introductions of our authors who, if you're here, you probably already know them. Katee Robert is a New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of contemporary romance and romantic suspense. Entertainment Weekly calls her writing unspeakably hot, or hot. Her books have sold over 1 million copies. She lives in the Pacific Northwest with her husband, children, a cat who thinks he's a dog, and 2 Great Danes who think they're lapdogs. LaQuette writes savvy, sexy, contemporary romance. She's the 2016 Author of the Year, Golden Apple Award winner, 2016 Right Touch Reader's Choice winner, and a 2018 Passionate Plume finalist. She's an advocate for diverse romance in the publishing industry. LaQuette is a native of Brooklyn, lives in the mountains with her book boyfriend husband and their 2 rambunctious kids. I need to get myself a book boyfriend husband. Adriana Anders writes award-winning and best-selling romantic suspense and contemporary romance, including Whiteout, a book page Best Book of the Year, an Entertainment Weekly Top 10 Romance, and an Oprah Mag Best Romance of 2020, and Under Her Skin, a Publishers Weekly Best Book of 2017. Today, she resides with her husband and children on the coast of France, so she's up very late for us, writing the stories of her heart. So, hello everyone. It's so great to see you.
Hello.
So this is a conversation about 50 Shades of Grey and how it's impacted your writing and maybe the publishing world altogether. So first of all, do you remember the first time you heard about 50 Shades and what was your reaction? I'm going to start with Adriana.
I'll be honest with you, I don't remember the first time I heard about it, but I do remember a couple things. One is that my father read it. He bought it. He spent actual money and he bought it and read it. And that was the only romance aside from mine that I've ever seen him reading. So that was a big deal for me. And then aside from that, I just remember the whole effect of people reading this book who would not normally read romance. And as somebody who had loved and read romance, including a lot of erotic romance before that, it felt sort of like vindication. So it was definitely a positive thing for me when that book hit all the charts.
Thank you. Katee?
I also don't remember the exact moment. It was a pretty tumultuous time in my life at the time, but I just remember looking up one day and it was like everywhere. And I was like, what is this book? And I was about to be published or had just been published. And so every time I had a conversation with somebody like, oh, I'm a romance author, they're like, oh, like 50 Shades. Like it totally changed like the perception of like romance authors specifically, as opposed to like, oh, like Fabio, it was like, oh, 50 Shades. Like that was the new cultural touchstone. And it still is, really, honestly. Like that's still like the number one question I get when I tell people I write romance. So it definitely shifted things like intensely, but it was right as I was getting started. So the whole industry shifted and it was just kind of blew my mind.
I think it blew a lot of ours. And I don't mean that in a punny type of a way. LaQuette?
I don't remember when it came out specifically. I do remember the conversations that were going on about it. And I think one of the things to note is that 50 Shades, although it wasn't the first erotic romance, because I know that Zane was writing erotic romance at least a decade before. So I was already reading that type of romance. But what 50 Shades was able to do was bring in people who had never, people from the mainstream, so to speak, who were not aware of what romance novels were really like. And it gave, once those readers finished 50 Shades, then they wanted to read more. So it brought outside readers, new readers into the industry, into the genre that weren't necessarily entertaining the idea of reading a romance prior to.
Do you think that it changed people's perceptions about what a romance could be in terms of it's still really steamy, but it has an excellent story? So did that in some way help you become a writer of erotic romance? And I'm going to go back to Adriana.
One thing it did, I think, was bring the romance perspective into our, I'm not going to say century because there's so much historical romance, but it definitely made it a more modern thing in the public eye, I think. I think for me personally, I'd read quite a bit of erotic romance before. There were some sort of specific anthologies that I had read from authors who I followed for a while. And but the thing that 50 Shades did is it brought BDSM to the forefront in a way I hadn't seen it, in the world, but everywhere, everyone was reading this stuff. So I think it was a positive thing on that front. It felt very positive to me.
Right. Katee?
Yeah, I definitely agree that it was positive. It brought a lot of, like, it became much more publicly, like, granted, like outside the romance genre, because like we have our interior industry stuff, but like widely spread, it was just more acceptable to read the saucy stuff. And even though they kind of like hee-heed about it and stuff, it still brought so many people back to reading for pleasure for the first time in their lives, like since like high school or whatever, like being like, oh, I can enjoy reading. And like 50 Shades success basically launched my career because I had a book that came out in 2012 that hit that wave and did really well. And it's because all those readers were looking for the next thing. And to date, like a large percentage of my readers and our readers started with 50 Shades or came to romance from 50 Shades, or like picked up a book for the first time in 10 years because of 50 Shades. And it also, I feel like, because of the content and because it was so explicit and because it had like BDSM elements, it brought forth a lot of conversations about consent and about what BDSM looks like, and about like safe, sane, consensual. And like, they were conversations that were happening within our industry already, but it pushed them forward in a big way, and like became much more like, okay, like, because people were critically reading it and having thoughts and feelings about it, it pushed forward the conversations that we were having within the industry, which in turn pushed forward a lot of the content of the romance novels that were published around that time and since, and made a big wave.
Thank you. LaQuette?
Again, I was reading erotic romance long before 50 Shades, and writing long before that. So I don't know that it, time-wise, it would have had the opportunity to influence me. It was definitely people like Zane and Velvet that I was able to read these really super hot books that were so like just the exploration of sexuality, especially from the female perspective, which we didn't often get a lot of in terms of mainstream work. So having 50 Shades come along afterwards and then kick that door open so that more people outside of those of us who are already reading and writing this, basically understood now, hey, this is actually real literature. And, we're really, there's so much more of it out there. And I don't think there would have been as much of a cultural shift without 50 Shades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I like to think that there was a confluence of when 50 Shades came out and the e-reader explosion. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on if erotica became more accessible, because at that time, more people were buying e-readers in order to read 50 Shades. So I'm going to actually start with Katee this time and go around the other way.
Yeah, I think that it was, because before that, like, obviously erotica existed, but a lot of times, like, you'd have to like buy the PDF or whatever and like read it on like however you could read it. And it did exist in print, but it wasn't taken as seriously by like publishers as a whole. Like they had their own imprints for it, and that like their own little pigeonhole that they'd shove it in, and it was those books. And so when 50 Shades came out and like was so widely successful, it kind of, in addition to the e-reader of having to take away that element of the cover, but even the covers of 50 Shades changed things too, because it wasn't like Fabio type, like, or like a clench or whatever. And it wasn't the first books to do that, but it was the first, like, that was everywhere to do that. And so that kind of took away some of the like shame elements of that people had previously, that had held them up from picking up romance or erotic romance or whatever. And I think the e-reader really contributes to that, because it's, it's right there and you can just do the thing.
LaQuette?
Yeah, the accessibility factor, I think, definitely ramped it up, because not only, for those who felt the need to conceal what they were reading, because, I didn't. I used to buy print, like heavy, thick print, hardcover books. But for those who needed that, that sort of concealment factor, that was fine. But also for people who may not have the time to sit and read with a book in their hands, right? So if you're a new mom and you've got kids, maybe an e-reader is a lot easier to hold in your hand to read and get a few pages, and then to actually sit down and turn pages of a print book. So it definitely gave that accessibility factor on multiple levels that I don't think I think, we have the e-reader, we have a lot to thank for in how popular erotic romance is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Adriana?
I want to speak to what LaQuette just said, because holding the e-reader. So just to bring this to writing, my first book, I was reading when I was nursing my second child. I was writing when I was nursing my second child. And I will never forget having her lying on this pillow in front of me and literally nursing her while I was typing on my computer, e-reader. It was just this like incredibly liberating thing to be able to do everything at the same time. And so I agree. I think it not only lent accessibility to us, but also a sort of legitimacy, like Katee was talking about. I think, publishers saw that this book was making money. This series was suddenly like putting us in a different sphere. I was not published back then, unlike Katee, but I suddenly felt like it was within reach. And not only was writing these books within reach, but it was something that was deemed worthy by the people around me. Like I said, my dad was reading this book, and it certainly opened doors on that front.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, it was it passed the subway test. I didn't mind, I didn't have to have a cover. If I had an e-reader, it was, I could read whatever I wanted, things like that. So I'm going to move into your books and your writing. LaQuette, when did your love affair with romance novels start, especially erotic romances?
I was about 16 years old when I picked up my first Harlequin Presents, which was The Devil's Price by Carol Mortimer. And it blew my little 16-year-old mind. And I, literally, I just devoured everything my local library had, every romance novel they had on the shelf. And so after reading that for a while, my tastes kind of waned because I didn't really see anyone on the page that kind of looked like me. So then entered Zane, and then entered Velvet, and Sandra Kitt, and a bunch of other POC authors who were writing experiences that I could relate to. And so it was just like, I'd never seen myself on the page before, but also the idea of this sexual exploration, which wasn't necessarily something that is celebrated so much in real life when it comes to women and women of color. So getting my hands on those books, I knew I wanted to write a book where I was writing about people I knew and have those characters come alive on the page.
Right. And celebrate their sexuality. Adriana?
Oh, I have kind of a weird mixed bag of an early road to romance. Mine is sort of half like, my dad seems to be a big figure in my history, but my father handing me like Clan of the Cave Bear when I was 10 years old, and he had ripped out all the sex scenes but one. He had forgotten one. So that was very formative for me. Like, I will never forget. And I found a library book on the sink in the library bathroom. That was a Sweet Dreams book when I was really young as well. And I found Flowers in the Attic on heater in my 6th grade classroom. So I would say, like, my love for romance in a weird way, and for kind of, dirty romance, came from those 3 books. After that, I went through a bunch of different things. I think in the early 2000s, I started finding these romance anthologies with Thea Devine and I think Susan Johnson. And I remember I was living in Paris with my ex-husband at the time, and those books sort of, saved my life. And then maybe 15 years ago, I started, or 10 years ago, I came across Kara McKenna, who was, my gosh, she was just revolutionary for me. I'd read so much romance over the years. I mean, the world had just opened up to me through these romances, but Kara, it was like she was inside my brain, and it was like like what LaQuette was saying about feeling like you found somebody who represents you. Now, totally different situation, but I was reading this woman and I felt like she was me. And it was the first time I had experienced that. And so I think for me, that was, so it was Kara McKenna and Anne Calhoun and Charlotte Stein. There were 3 authors who were writing at the same time, maybe 10 years ago or so. And it changed the way I perceived. I read those books and I thought, oh, maybe I can write these books too. Maybe there's a place for me there. So it was liberating.
I feel like I should be taking notes because I want to read all these authors now, if I haven't already. Katee?
I came to romance and erotic romance, well, not like saucy romance at the same time. My mother was a big suspense reader and she was a fan of Iris Johansen. And so I read one of those books after she did. And at my library, I was like, oh, this is an Iris Johansen book. And it was Magnificent Rogue. And it was one of her historicals. And it was like, I reread it like a couple years ago because I was like, surely it wasn't as saucy as I felt at 13. Like, surely I was just like 13 and like, no, it's a scorcher. So after reading that, I inhaled her entire romantic backlist. But I didn't really understand at the time that there was more, that more existed. And so I kind of wandered off, and shortly after that, urban fantasy became really hot. And that was like the big thing that was everywhere. And I enjoyed it, but I wanted more romance, and I kept like getting stressed out because the stories would get darker and darker and darker. And so from there kind of fell into paranormal romance with like J.R. Ward and like those authors that were like getting started around that time. And just realized like, oh, this is what I've been looking for. And that's kind of, I mean, it's history from there. That was probably like the early 2000 or like 2005, 2007, somewhere in there. And yeah, so, but I started real hot.
And we thank you for it. Okay, so let's dive into your books. We're just going to talk a little bit about your current titles, and I'm going to start with Adriana because I talked with her. Tell us about Whiteout.
So Whiteout came out last year, just before the pandemic, and it is a book about a virus. So the timing is interesting. It's a book about survival, and it is a couple who, not a couple in the beginning of the book, enemies, sort of, who wind up, I've got it here too, who wind up having to survive out on the ice in the most dangerous place on the planet. And that's where the idea came from, was, gosh, and part of it is a challenge, like how can you make romance happen when it really seems like all odds, against all odds. And it was a challenge that I really enjoyed, getting these 2 people on the ice, getting them together, finding a way to put them together. And the second book, Uncharted, and I wish I had a copy of it here, but I give it to my mother, is out next month. So that's out on August 24th. And that is a book that takes place in Alaska. And it's a continuation of the story with this virus that was discovered under the ice, with big baddies in the background trying to gain control of the virus, and people who have to fight tooth and nail to survive.
Ooh, it sounds a little bit like everything. So then I'm going to go to Katee with Neon Gods.
Yep. Neon Gods is a contemporary Hades and Persephone retelling, and it's kind of my spin on things. Like, I was not married to the myth 100%, but Persephone is a socialite type, and she gets ambushed with a marriage to Zeus, and she's not super into that, so she flees across the river Styx and into Hades' arms, and they have kind of a mutually beneficial revenge pact that is also a sex pact, and it's very saucy, and yeah, I had a lot of fun with it. It was just a lot of like a very self-indulgent writing experience for me, because it's all my favorite things like in one book.
I love mythological stories, especially if they have some sauce in them.
Yeah.
LaQuette, we're talking about Jackson.
Jackson. Jackson is a sort of quasi enemies to lovers book. Two characters at first can't really stand each other. The heroine is the owner of a ranch that's being sabotaged. And in order to figure out who's behind that sabotage, the Texas Rangers are called in. And the lead ranger, Jackson, is a handful. He comes to the ranch with his own perceptions and judgments and prejudices, and Asia basically breaks down all of that and does it her way without compromise, which kind of gets on his nerves. But it was a lot of fun writing the two of them, because they were very much the same, but still so very opposite in their worldviews and how they move through the world.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, Asia is this very like open person who wants to save everyone in the world. And Jackson is like, no, you can't just let everyone in. You're going to be in danger, but it doesn't really compute for her.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, I read it. It's amazing. So, writing erotica or saucy stories or, something with a little bit more heat. I'm wondering how you balance the heat with the story to make sure that they are balanced, that there's, because, the perception before 50 Shades was that, oh, that's just mommy porn. Well, it's not. There's real stories to this. So I'm wondering, how do you balance that? And I'm going to start with Katee this time.
I'll be honest, my editor helps a ton, because I definitely I write really tightly as far as like, I don't pause a lot for the various emotional fleshing out stuff, and I jump from action to action to action. And so it's very helpful to have a good editor that's like, hey, it would be super awesome if maybe they had a conversation or two here, or like, oh, what's the room look like that they're in, or just because it's all like, and I don't necessarily mean action of like the sexual nature, just like, but like action, fight, sex, whatever. So it's helpful to me personally, just because even though I've been doing this a while now, it's still having that outside perspective of like, oh no, or you're missing something here, or this is a little shallow, or because I don't naturally balance well. I definitely need help with that.
Mm-hmm. I think you do a really good job. I really love Neon Gods.
Thank you.
You and your editor. LaQuette, how do you balance it?
I'm a character-driven writer, so I'm really all about the feels. My editor has to tell me to do the other things like action and all of that, because I just don't, to me, plot is really just a mechanism to get them into bed. Mm-hmm. And so my editor always has to say, hey, you said this and thus back there, but here you're saying something else, so we got to make that make sense. I'm like, oh yeah, I did say that. So, but for me, I never get the emotion wrong. Like the emotional arc is always spot on. So I think Katee and I are opposites in that regard.
Well, it takes it all works. That's the important thing. Adriana?
Well, weirdly, I'm half and half, just to balance things out. I know Katee and I have the same editor on some of our books, and literally what she just said is exactly what I've heard from Mary Altman, who's wonderful.
We all have the same editor.
We all have the same wonderful editor. So Mary will tell me, this is great. I feel the characters, like I'm in their head. I know exactly how they feel, but can you give me a little, of what's happening on the outside? So yeah, I mean, it's kind of an adventure. Every book for me has been different. I have books that I will write really quickly, and it's like the characters they just do their thing. I'm just a set of fingers. And then there's some books where I have to really work hard to get into their heads and flesh out the story and so on. So it's a mixed bag.
So I didn't get a chance to ask Erica this question, so I'm going to ask you, is how do you get into the right headspace to write like a super sexy scene? Do you have to like be off by yourself? I mean, what does it take to write a sexy scene that's still emotional and gets a point across, as opposed to just being sex? And this time I'm starting with LaQuette.
I have a playlist called Sexy Times. And literally that's what music helps me emote. So whatever it is, the emotion that I'm trying to portray in the books, I try to get a playlist together that sort of helps me feel that, because I have to feel it in order to express it in the books. So I listen to really filthy music at times. Trey Songz is definitely on the top of that list. He is so ridiculously filthy. And that gets my brain working as to what these characters should be doing in this scene at this point.
Good to know. Good to know. Adriana.
Oh, no, I've written some of my dirtiest stuff in a coffee shop with kids playing behind me.
You gotta do what you gotta do.
There was this coffee shop where I used to write that we called the Dirty Turtle, because they had a big dirty like play structure behind us. And I would always just try and make sure my back wasn't to the kids. The sexy times, honestly, are the easiest for me. Everything, and even in the most action-driven books, everything pivots on the sexy times and will often inform what happened before, and I have to go back and fix things. I feel like those intimate moments decide character arcs. It is the thing that I feel most comfortable writing. And I try not to, and I can actually tell with my book, if my characters aren't getting together, I can tell that I don't know them well enough. And so it tells a lot. It tells a lot to me, but I can write it anywhere. It's my favorite.
Next time I see you in a Starbucks, I'll know what you're doing. Katee.
The only time I struggle with like the high heat scenes is like first thing in the morning, because I'm not functioning on all cylinders. But I have a 6-year-old who I've written like a gajillion books since he's been born, and so there is no sacred time to do the thing. Like I'm interrupted every 10 minutes. But the sex scenes are actually the one thing that I do that rarely needs to be fleshed out further, because it's so, like Adriana said, it's so like telling of my characters and it's so unique to them. And so it's like a fun exploration for me to be like, oh, we're doing this. Like, this is something that you're into. Well, now I know so much more about you because this is something that like in how they communicate. And it's just, those are my favorite scenes because they are the most transparent for me as an author and like how these characters exist. But yeah, and if I'm not mildly uncomfortable while writing them, then I'm probably not pushing the envelope quite enough. And so that's something that's kind of like my meter gauge. Like if I'm bored, then I'm doing something wrong and I zigged when I should have zagged. So then I go back and I figure it out.
Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure how this question will come across, but I'm wondering how much your readers have to do with the decisions you make for your book, either more heat, less heat, story-wise, next characters in a series, things like that. Adriana?
Oh, yeah, I'm not very good at doing, just in life in general, but specifically in writing, I'm not very good at doing things according to any sort of plan. So it's a very destructured existence that I lead. So outlines are really tough for me. And if readers want things, that's wonderful. And I would love to be able to integrate things, but it's hard enough for me to just, include a beginning, middle, and end. So I'm not, there are people who can parse out their work and who understand story beats and things like that. And I've never been able to do that. It just happens. My brain just provides it and there it is. And so, yeah, I would love to write, stories for characters. I mean, for readers. I think Katee is able to do stuff like that. Like I've seen her develop little shorts and stuff from what her readers ask for, but I haven't been able to yet. maybe one day.
Katie?
I have a balance because I was so like when I write books, I do sequel bait really intensely because I like a cast of characters and I know in my head like approximately who's coming next. And so it's a very intentional thing to start building interest for those readers, and oftentimes I'll do it in spite of readers because they'll tell me they don't want something and I'll be like, but do you not want something, or are you gonna let me convince you? And but when I get a lot of reader requests, like for a long time with one of my older series, I was getting requests for people like more books by this character or with this character or more scenes or whatever. And so I actually started a Patreon. And so every month they get to vote and they tell me what short to write. And that's kind of how I balance it, because I function best when I'm in barely controlled chaos as far as like what projects I'm picking. And I've learned that trying to structure too intensely leads me to burnout, which is not good for anyone. And so by not allowing like contracts are one thing, but not allowing readers to dictate what comes next actually provides them with better stories, because I'm allowed to follow my bliss, which is where the good stuff is. So yeah, that's kind of my balance.
Oh, okay. LaQuette?
I can't say that I write what readers want to. I write what I want to write. I write the story that I want to tell. And I'm wholly focused on that story when I'm writing it. Like, I wish I could be like Katie and write all these multiple things at once. My brain really doesn't work like that. I think what I am able to do in order to meet reader expectation is it really depends on like what line I'm writing for. So if I write for another publisher, I write category romances, which traditionally aren't necessarily as high heat as some other stories I might write. So for that line, I would calm the sex down. I mean, it's still there and it's still very explicit, but it's just not as buck wild as I get in some of my other books.
Well, we all need a variety. So we are starting to get audience questions, but before we get to those, I just want to ask really quickly if you could talk about what's next for you. Katie?
My next release is an indie release, which will come out in September. And it's actually a second generation series to like my Mob series, because that's one of the ones that it was sort of a reader thing that I said I wouldn't do unless I had a story to tell. And then a couple things happen and then I had a story to tell. And so we're doing it. And so it's it's a mob romance with kidnapping as a love language. It's I'm very excited. Again, it's all my favorite things like wrapped into one. It was very self-indulgent. My next traditional release is in January, which is the sequel to Neon Gods. It's Electric Idol. It's Psyche and Eros, and it's I was supposed to murder you, but I'm going to marry you instead, in like marriage of convenience. And I'm really excited for people to read it and also nervous.
Well, I'll look forward to that. LaQuette?
My next release happens in September. It's category romance, and it's basically Black Dynasty set in Brooklyn. So I'm really excited about that.
Oh, is that why you were watching Dynasty?
Yes. It was market research.
Oh, it's funny. And Adriana, I know you mentioned the next book in your series. Are there others coming up?
I'm working on something right now called Kink Camp, which is
Tell us more.
Yes, please.
Kink Camp is actually based on a true experience that I had going to Kink Camp. So it's not, I mean, it is fiction, obviously, because it's not my story. It's not about me, but it's sort of a follow-up to Daddy Crush, which was an indie book that I wrote. It was my pandemic book, and it was my happy, super sexy, short but fun. And so Kink Camp is coming out. I don't know when. I've got a cover, and I'm about halfway through. It's just summertime, so there are distractions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll look forward to that one too. And I'll remember that it's not autobiographical. So Melissa would like to know, is there a romance subgenre that you haven't written yet that you would like to try? And I think I'm at LaQuette.
Yes, I have a Sleepy Hollow fanfic germinating in my brain.
Oh my God.
And one of these days, it's going to be sort of quasi-paranormal, which is so out of my wheelhouse, but I'm going to do it. So one of these days.
I'm going to read it. Adriana.
Oh, totally paranormal as well. I've had this sort of witchy thing in my head for a while. I just haven't had time to do it. And I just went to an aquarium this week, and I have this like plankton based thing in my brain. It's like, it just, from the depths, just a depths, paranormal, weird, but super sexy romance, because that's what it always is.
Well, before I get to Katee, I have to ask the shape of water question, which I often ask for paranormal questions, is how do they,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they don't have to tell us on screen, right? They don't have to.
She did. She said that.
But that's not erotica.
Oh, well, no, that is not erotica.
Okay, I'll hold off to read, your paranormal to find out. Katee.
I want to write a fantasy with a high heat level, and I'm actually going to do it next. I was like, it's like a project I've been sitting on for like 8 years now, because it was never the right time, and it's gone through a bunch of iterations, and I decided that now is the time to do it. I'm going to do it, and we'll see what happens. But I'm really excited about it, because it's fantasy is like my one true love, and I've always felt like I wasn't ready to like try it, but I'm never going to feel like I'm ready to try it, so I'm just going to do it.
Okay, so a super saucy fantasy.
Yeah, like a high fantasy, just with a high heat level as well.
Okay, so I might have the same shape of water question for you, like dragons.
No, they're going to be people.
Okay.
Yeah, they're going to be people. Maybe some shifter type elements, but no monster elements in that series.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for clearing that up for me. So Jen asks, has the quarantine affected your writing at all? And I think I'm back with Adriana.
Oh yeah, definitely. You know what? First of all, it's affected my reading. It has been really difficult for me to concentrate on books that I would have been able to read before. And so I've just wanted to write really short and really sexy and really low conflict. So Daddy Crush, that came out late last year, was just extremely low conflict, very, very sexy, very tropey, but also just really easy and nice. Like, you want these people to get together, and they do, and it's lovely.
Sounds like what we need right now too. Katee?
I am privileged enough that I write when I'm under stress, and it's still stressful. So I actually like had the highest output year like ever, just because the only time I'm ever like remotely alone is in my office. So if I'm in my office, I might as well work. But yeah, I started a Taboo series that's very like similar to the Daddy Crush, that it's just high heat, like not incredibly angsty, like it's a short saucy book that doesn't have high stakes, and like that was really comforting to me to just be able to kind of like let off some steam that way. But yeah, my reading took a huge hit too, or not a hit, but like I started reading horror because it just like was very cathartic to like experience the scary emotions, but then it resolves, unlike reality. So yeah, so I wrote a lot of like really high heat books just to kind of get a break.
Thank you. LaQuette?
My reading has actually increased as a means of escapism. But my writing, I thank goodness for my accountability partner. Without her, I've had a very productive year, but it's only because my accountability partner is in my text messages at 8 something every morning. Hey girl, are we writing? Are we writing today? And even if I don't want to, it's like, dang it, she's in my text messages. I have to go downstairs now and write. So thank you, Christy Caldwell. You're helping me complete my contracts.
I love that you just called out Christy Caldwell. Like when I say something like that, it's like John Smith or something. Okay. Gosh, so we have one last reader attendee question from Lisa. What are you reading and loving right now? I know reading has taken a hit for for a couple of you. So anything right now that you can recommend, Katee?
Yes, actually, I just finished. I'm on actually a really great reading kick. I've read like 6 books in a row that have rocked my world. But the one I just finished recently that like blew my socks off was a YA horror. It's White Smoke by Nicole D. Jackson. And it's upcoming. I think it comes out in like September, October, but it's like a haunted house element. And it's the way that she built the scares was so authentic and so natural. And there was not like normally there's just, it scared me really much. Like I had to stop reading when the sun went down, and I was like just delighted by that. And the heroine, I just wanted to like hug her because she's going through a rough time. And it's just, it doesn't let you breathe, which is amazing because it sucked me in, and I read it in like 2 days only because I had to stop when the sun went down. So highly recommend that one when it comes out.
I will look for that. LaQuette.
Road to Rosebud by Naima Simone. The hero is a cinnamon roll in the streets and a boss in the sheets. Like he is so amazing. And it's such a bittersweet story. There's so much emotion. I mean, 2 things that Naima does well are emotion, heavy emotion, and sex. And so this book is filled with both. So I recommend it. Please go get it. You will not regret it.
My TBR pile is starting to explode. Adriana?
Right now I'm finally reading the Bromance book club by Lyssa Kay Adams, which I hadn't read when it came out. Excuse me. And really enjoying it. It's just really nice to see things from a different perspective. And Exposed, Kristen Callahan, which I read an early version of. It's just super sexy and emotional and all the stuff I love. And actually, I keep reading Katee's short, sexy taboo books. They're tiding me over. So
It's escapism. It's like you're safe there. It's not high stakes.
They're perfect.
Oh, well, that is a perfect place to end as well. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughtfulness around the 50 Shades conversation and all of these book recommendations. Like I said, all of our TBR piles are about to tip over. So before everybody goes, I just wanted to say, thank you for everybody who participated in the book club today. Sourcebooks has listed the winners in the chat. If you're a winner, please email Lizzie Lewandowski with your mailing address to claim your prize. Her email is also in the chat. Thank you again to everyone who joined us. Make sure to join us next month on Wednesday, August 11th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time for a panel featuring Sandra Kitt, Ronnie Lauren, and Anna Harrington. Sourcebooks has added a link in the chat so that you can sign up right now. Do it. And they'll also be sending an email follow-up as a reminder. I hope you all have a great night. Thank you again, Adriana, Katee, LaQuette. This has been wonderful.